Okay everyone, welcome to Learn How to Ask Questions That Matter. I'm your host Gary Ryan from Organisations That Matter, and welcome today, and thank you for coming along to join us. And hopefully you'll get quite a lot of value out of this 40 minutes that we have together. I see that we've just had a few more people just join us right now as we've just gotten started. As we go through, I encourage you to take notes. There is a lot of information that I will be providing you. As we go along, what I'll in fact do today, because of the nature of this particular webinar, please feel free to raise your hand. You'll find in the little dialog box in the top right hand corner of your screen that if you click on the little hand, that'll notify me that you've got a question. And I'm actually happy to take questions as we go through today. I may respond very quickly and say, look, I think I'm going to cover that information a little bit later on, but if I'm not sure that I am, I'll certainly do my best to answer your question at the time. Or in fact, we can tap into the wisdom within the folk that we have online at the moment and get that information potentially from other participants. Also, as I've already mentioned, we are recording today's webinar, so you will have the opportunity to review this webinar later on, and I will send you all a link to the webinar by early next week, if not later today, if I can arrange to have that done. A little bit about myself, Gary Ryan, Director of Organisations That Matter. Organisations That Matter really exist to help individuals, teams and organisations to matter. And what we mean by that is individuals, teams and organisations, firstly to matter to themselves, to actually be the best that they can be, to matter to the people that you serve, whether that be as an employee within an organisation or as an organisation to whoever it is that you're providing your services or products to, and also to enable you to matter to the broader community, which at the end of the day we're all part of. And we do that through aligning people, systems and strategy together to enable people to matter the most that they can possibly do to make a good difference and positive difference to this world. There's a range of the broad number of organisations with whom we work. And some of you in the audience are members of some of these organisations we have up there at the moment. So what's the focus of today's webinar? And the beauty of today's webinar is we are focusing purely on questions, which is quite different for most people, because most people are used to focusing on answers rather than focusing on questions. And as we'll see as we progress through this particular webinar, focusing on questions is something that people don't normally do, and yet it's a huge opportunity to develop your skills, your interpersonal skills, your leadership skills, if you can focus on developing this particular skill set. So I'm really pleased that you're with us. So what's the structure of the session? We'll spend the first few minutes, as we are already doing, in the introduction section. Then we'll just go over some basics and get some input from yourselves through some polls. And then we'll spend the majority of the webinar going over questions in depth. This is quite a large topic, so of course we're not going to be able to cover absolutely everything. So I've just tried to pick out the main gems that I think will be of significant value for each of you who are participating in today's webinar to get the most out of this session. And then at the end we'll spend a few minutes just wrapping up and explaining about some of the other things that are going on with organisations that matter. I love this quote from Einstein: if I had an hour to solve a question that would save my life, I'd spend the first 55 minutes asking, what's the question I need to ask? And I figure if it's good enough for Albert Einstein to focus on the importance of questions, it's good enough for me. And you know, that's a really powerful question. And if you think about it, how often when you're in a meeting, whether it be at work or at university or wherever you might be, even within your family, how often are you focusing on what's the question that needs to be asked here to help us to get to wherever we are going, get to whatever answer will really help us to get us to improve, whatever it might be, versus the focus that we tend to have on just trying to come up with answers and put our particular view of the world in front of other people and trying to get them to accept it. What I'd like to do is to challenge you with a quick little question. So I'm just going to launch a poll here for you. And the question is, the research indicates that children ask on average how many questions per day? So we'll just find the poll for you. And I'll just launch that poll. So you have an opportunity. You can say, is it 5? Is it 74? Is it 126? Is it 312? is it 511? And when we say children, I mean children up to the age of around about 5 years of age. So how many questions per day do you think children of around about 5 years of age ask per day? Got some answers coming in at the moment. Oh, we've got a good even spread here. Okay, I'll just close the poll and share the results with you. Now, as you can see, a third of us believe that it's 74 questions per day. About half of us believe it's 126 questions per day, and a quarter of us, believe that it's 312. So a quarter of us are at 74, half of us say 126, and a quarter of us are saying 312. The research says, in fact, it's 126. So half of us got that right, not that there's anything wrong with the other two guesses. But what we can see there is that children do ask a lot of questions per day. So I'll just hide that poll for you and we'll just return back to the screen. I'm interested, and you can either type in or raise your hand, what types of questions do you think children mostly ask? So if anyone would like to try answering that question, please raise your hand. What types of questions, or you can type your answer in. What types of question? Okay, we've got Gladys was in first. Gladys, is your microphone working there? Okay, we're just checking Gladys's microphone. Okay, for some reason I'm not able to get that going. I'll just check with Jock. Jock, is your microphone going?
No.
Yes, it sounds like it is.
Right. Sorry, yes it is.
Yes, it is. What's your answer to that particular question? How many? What do you think is the typical characteristics of children's questions?
In my experience, they tend to ask why questions.
Exactly. That is exactly right. And I noticed that that's the answer that people are typing in as you've just answered that as well. So people recognise that children tend to ask why questions. If we were a huge audience, we'd give you a nice little clap for that answer. Thanks, Jock. And also to Gladys and Julie as well, who got that one correct. So thank you, Jock. I'll just close the microphone there. Have you got any other comments, particularly about why questions, particularly as an experienced grandfather these days?
Mostly they ask why questions because their little professors have worked out that whatever answer you give to a why question leads to another why question.
Very, very clever.
Endlessly in conversation.
And that's very powerful, in fact. In fact, you've led us in, Jock, to a technique that a lot of people recommend is to, in fact, ask 3 to 5 why questions in a row when you really want to get to the root cause of something that's going on. So if you've got a serious problem, you literally ask 3 to 5 why questions in a row. So each time the answer comes up, you ask another why question to do that. Thanks for sharing that with us, Jock. Now what I'd like you to do is just to ask the question, what do you think the research indicates regarding how many questions per day that adults ask? And in this case, we're saying 17-year-olds or above. So I'll just launch this poll for you. Let's see what you think the answers are. You've got the same choices again, 5, 74, 126, 312, and 511. Just give you a few more seconds to type in your answers. Just a little bit longer. Okay. We'll close that poll. This is very interesting. Have a look at the response there, folks. 2/3 of us have said 5 questions per day, and 1/3 have said 74. Isn't that interesting? Does anyone like to make a comment as to why you think adults are asking, in majority, according to our response, and in fact the research indicates it is 5 or less. So once we get to 17, it's 5 or less questions per day. So why do we, does anyone like to raise their hand and make any comments about why we think adults, 17-year-olds or above, are only asking 5 or less questions per day? Please feel free to raise your hand if you'd like to have a go at answering that question or any thoughts on it. Okay, Frank. Frank, would you like to share your thoughts on that, please?
I don't know about why they ask 5 or less, but if you're in a role where you need to interrogate a lot of data or investigate things, you'll certainly ask a lot more questions than 5 a day. You might ask 5 in a minute. And then that's why I scored in the 74 area.
Okay, and now
that's my share.
And is that was that questions to other people, or is that more questions to yourself as you're exploring the data?
Oh, that's both, but a lot of the time they're questions directed at people who know about what gives rise to the data.
Terrific. So in that example, you've got a role that requires people to actually get to understand what data means, which then takes you to asking lots of questions. And what that highlights is that when we're seeking understanding, we tend to ask lots of questions. And the evidence might suggest that for a lot of adults, we're not actually seeking understanding, which is why we don't ask many questions. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay. Thanks for that, Frank. That's terrific. Yes, and Gladys has suggested that social and cultural customs prohibit or do not consider asking questions as an appropriate thing to do, and that is a reality. And sometimes it's worth asking ourselves, why do some cultures within organisations and or national cultures not encourage people to ask questions? Why are the structures present to reduce people asking questions? Now, I don't know the answer for that particular question myself, but it is one to consider with regards to how and why people ask less questions over time. Interestingly, the research is from all cultures, and it sort of suggests that irrespective of cultural background, those statistics are fairly accurate, that as children, lots of questions are asked, and once we get to 17-year-olds or above, less questions are asked. And sometimes that can mean that, in fact, the systems that we're going through, and maybe it's partly to do with the education system. If you think about it, you've got one teacher in front of 25 to 30 students, depending on the school structure. And if each of those children are asking 126 questions per day, the teacher is not able to handle it. So very, very quickly they put systems in place to reduce the number of questions that people are actually asking. And that might be, there's not been conclusive research in that particular space at the moment to clarify exactly what the reasons are for why there seems to be less questions being asked, but that might be a contributing factor. And similarly in organisations, often you've got one manager with lots of direct reports. If they're handling all sorts of questions from those direct reports, maybe that might get them to put in structures in place to reduce the number of questions being asked. So there are a whole range of factors there contributing to that. What types of questions do you think adults respond to in a way where it feels like someone's pointing a finger in their chest? And I'll open up the microphones for you. So what types of questions, before we heard that children tend to ask why questions mostly out of the questions that they ask, and now I'm asking, what types of questions do you think adults tend to respond to as if they are being poked in the chest? Julie's suggesting that maybe they think they've got the world all worked out. That could be a reason, that if you think you've got the world all worked out, then you would respond as if you're being poked in the chest when someone asks a question of you. What types of questions do we think people would respond to like that? Mostly as adults, that is. So if you're thinking about as an adult, what are the types of questions, the question structures if you like, what word in particular do you think questions start with that get adults to be a little bit defensive or feel like, gee, I'm getting poked in the chest here? Jock's got a suggestion for us. Jock, what are your thoughts?
I feel as though I'm being poked in the chest when people ask me questions that start off with the sentence, you know a lot of shit, or you know everything, tell me the answer to this question. Or they presuppose that because I'm old and decrepit that I've been around long enough to actually find out a whole lot of stuff.
So when the expert label is poked at you, that's when you find that you feel like people are poking you in the chest, when they've labelled you an expert and therefore you should know the answer, correct?
That's right, exactly.
So that's one type. Thanks, Jock, again. Frank's also got a suggestion for us. Frank?
Sometimes when you get asked to explain why you did something, or obviously in a way in which why did you behave in a certain way, that can sort of get you back up, I guess. Particularly, I suppose, yeah.
So keep going, Frank.
Yeah, particularly for myself, I find that is when someone's asked me to do something that's within my field of sort of expertise. Well, then they ask me as to, well, why have you recommended this, or why did you decide that, etc. And sometimes, despite your best attempts to already explain those sorts of things, sometimes it feels like you're getting poked in the chest.
Spot on. Often adults, which is really interesting, and thanks again, Frank and Jock, for your contributions there. It's really interesting that adults respond to questions, often if it's the why question, as if we're being poked in the chest. And it's really interesting because the research says that children ask mostly why questions, and we're generally okay with that, except for when why is the sky blue? Those sorts of questions can be challenging for us. But as adults, when people say why, as Frank's just been highlighting, that when we get asked why, it's like our expertise in particular is being threatened. And this is where the tone with which we use when we ask why questions becomes absolutely critical. For example, if I said, why did you do that, versus, please help me to understand why you did that. The tone in my question, and even the slight change in question structure, has a massive impact potentially on someone feeling like I'm poking them in the chest. And so the tone of your questions, particularly when you're asking why questions as an adult, is absolutely critical to lessen the chance that the person is going to feel like you're poking them in the chest. Oh, you might have had an emotional response to this particular image, because this is also a characteristic of questions that can get people on the defensive. And this is when our questions are in fact loaded guns, when our questions are loaded in such a way that the person is very, very likely to sense that in answering our question, we're just going to get shot straight after. So we're effectively giving someone a golden or a silver bullet to shoot us with when we answer their question. So a real challenge for us is when we're asking questions is to challenge ourselves to say, is this question I'm about to ask a loaded gun? A technique that people use that is very much like a loaded gun is the statement followed by a closed question. So often salespeople will use a technique like this where they'll say something like, this is a great car, that's the statement, isn't it? Closed question, because it's like a yes-no answer. And it's a loaded gun in the context of if you don't agree, then you might look like a bit of an idiot. And you'll notice in conversations as you become more aware of this, how many people are actually asking loaded gun questions where they're making a statement followed by a closed question. We're going to talk a little bit more about open and closed questions in a moment. Now notice the difference to your feeling with this image on your screen versus this one. In this particular image, what we're doing is we're trying to illustrate the purpose of questions is to ask for understanding, that we're using questions to increase our understanding versus using questions as a loaded gun. Now, as I'll explain in a moment, there's nothing wrong with closed questions. It's just that when we use them as a way to basically load up a particular direction or a particular response that we actually want versus really trying to understand where someone's coming from and really to get a better understanding collectively of what it is that we're trying to do and work on. So there's fundamentally the two types of basic questions. The first type is questions that are closed questions or yes-no type responses. Now, they're not just yes-no responses to a closed question, but they usually have a limited response with what they are. For example, if I ask the question, what time is it? There really is a specific response that I'm after, which is the answer to the question of what the time is. It's not an open-ended question where you've got more than one answer that you're looking for. Often closed questions are very useful, in fact, at the start of meetings, and they can also be at the end of meetings or conversations to just get clarity about what we're trying to do. So using closed questions at the start of meetings and at the end of meetings is quite useful. They can be used to quickly clarify a situation or an understanding. Look, this is what I just heard you say, and you might explain what you think you've heard someone just say. Is that accurate? You know, that's a closed question, but it's useful to get some clarity for the moment. And then they can also be used as leads to open-ended questions. For example, is my understanding correct that I've just explained? Yes, it is. Okay, so now I'd like to explore what we might be able to do if we worked even more closely together. So we've gone from a closed question to an open-ended question, and I'll talk more about open-ended questions in a moment. So closed questions are fine. It's just that in our society we probably tend to overuse them and use them in such a way that the questions are much more like a loaded gun rather than trying to use closed questions to lead into open questions to enable us to increase our understanding. So just on your screens you've got some quick examples of what some common closed questions would be. What time is it? How many people will be affected? When did that happen? Did you make a mistake? Is that correct? Do you prefer A or B? That's an example of when we've basically got a list, and again we're just looking for one response, so that's why it's a closed question. And again, just reinforcing that closed questions can be very useful at the start and end of meetings. Again, as we go through, please feel free to ask questions or raise your hands, whatever the case may be. The second type of basic question structure is being open-ended questions. So these are questions that in fact have a lot of possibilities. And a subtle difference between a closed question and an open question would be something like, did you make your sales target? That's a closed question versus how have sales been going? We're giving the person a lot more scope to answer the question and to give us a much more deep answer with the open style of question versus the closed style of question. So often someone would probably use a closed question in this instance, but maybe an open question, and I'll just repeat those two questions, the closed question being, did you make your sales target, versus the open question, how have sales been going? And most people tend to use the first type, the closed question type, when maybe the open question style is more valuable. And open questions increase possibilities for answers. They can increase understanding. And the interesting thing with an open question is as that question asker, you're handing control over to the answerer because they can take the answer wherever they like. And that's something that a lot of people struggle with because you've got a lot more control with closed questions. Once you start asking open questions, you are becoming a bit more vulnerable to the answerer taking their answer wherever they like. A powerful aspect of open questions is that if you start concentrating on looking for the open questions to ask, what's the right question I need to ask here to help us to get to wherever it is we're going, it enhances your listening. And without even having to concentrate on enhancing your listening, once you start to commence concentrating on focusing on what's the right question to ask in this situation that will help us, that's particularly an open question, it's amazing how your listening will automatically increase and be enhanced. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. And of course, open questions can catalyse more conversation, more debate, and over time increase more understanding. So some examples include, what do you think about that? What possibilities come to mind? What might happen if you? What have you tried before? What might you do next? What other options can we think of? What resources have we never used before for this issue? What do we expect to happen if we do that? What's stopping us? What if? And there's lots of other types of questions. And you might notice that I haven't spoken much about how and why questions in this particular set of questions. And we'll talk a little bit more about them in a moment, and we already have spoken about why questions. I would like to speak a little bit about what if questions. Now, what if questions can be unbelievably powerful in an organisational and a personal setting. Now, I know it's not particularly clear, this image on your screen, but this is the image from the Black Eyed Peas about to perform a song for Oprah Winfrey at the opening of her 24th season in Chicago. And there was 20,000 people in this crowd. And in the very front centre of the stage, where the crowd commences, is a single woman who started to dance on her own when the Black Eyed Peas started singing their song. Now, what had happened was eventually the whole crowd of 20,000 people started to do a choreographed dance for Oprah, commencing with just this one person. And like a ripple, it spread throughout the 20,000 people in the crowd. And that all happened, and at the end, Oprah Winfrey just says, "Oh my God, how did you do that? That was amazing." Now, Oprah Winfrey is the richest woman in the world. And an Australian chap called Michael, who was the choreographer for this, asked the question, what if we were able to provide the richest woman in the world with a gift that is so unique she could not possibly have it in her house already, or she could not possibly have experienced it before? And what he did was, with a bunch of people, when they asked that question, they said, what could we do? And they came up with, hey, what if we could get 20,000 people, so another what if question, to do a dance for Oprah? And what if we could get one person to start that dance and then get everyone to do it? It was unbelievably powerful. And I encourage you to either go to the otmlearningnetwork.com, where we've got that video embedded in the site, or to actually do a Google on it for Oprah Winfrey and the Black Eyed Peas, and you'll actually get to see how this works. And how they did it was quite amazing. They only had 200 amateur dancers who they trained, spread them throughout the crowd. Before the Black Eyed Peas came onto the stage, they said to the crowd, "How you look at the people waving. These people are going to do a dance. Look for the people closest to you, and if you want to be in it, we can all give Oprah a gift that she's never had before, an experience she's never had before, and you can participate in it." And so right up until the Black Eyed Peas started singing, they didn't know if it would work. And as you'll see in the video, if you go and look it up, it is absolutely amazing. And it just comes from people having the courage to ask what-if questions. Now, on the screen, we have an example of a what-if questions that I've had the pleasure to have been involved in a service organisation that I was working with, where the shared services team, so that's people like human resources, the information technology team, the finance team, the marketing team, that in reality the quality of service that those teams were delivering was very, very poor. The internal customers of those particular services were consistently frustrated by the level of service that was being provided by those particular shared services. And what we did was we organised for every single employee in shared services to come together in what's known as a strategic conversation. And they had a conversation around this question: what if shared services was the most profitable department for our organisation? Now, you can probably imagine that for a lot of those people in that room, this was like speaking another language to them. What do you mean? We're an internal service. We don't make money. How does that work? So it was a paradigm-shifting question. Now, the interesting output from this question is that within 18 months, the IT area in particular was generating a couple of $100,000 worth of consulting revenue. They got this question, and what they understood was, gee, we should be so good, we should be able to provide services externally. Not that we have to, but that's how good we were. So that's the measuring stick that they set up for themselves, and as a result of that, other organisations that interacted with the organisation at the time found out how good this IT team were and started to engage them to do work for them. And actually, now, they did not become, in the period of time that I was there, the most profitable department in the organisation, but they did start to generate money, but more importantly, the quality of the service across the shared services to their internal customers increased dramatically because of the power of the what if question. So, some examples of what if questions. What if at the start of each meeting we were to identify the 3 most critical questions that require our attention? Imagine if you asked a question like that at the start of your meeting, and maybe even if you structured that question in. So this is a question about generating questions, and we'll talk more about that in a moment as well. What if we went for a walking meeting? Just a client I was speaking with yesterday, after some work that we'd done with them about personal planning, just got him thinking. He said, you know what, why don't we, and he asked this of his team, why don't we go for walking meetings every once in a while? Why do we have to sit in a cold office staring at each other around the table? What if we could spend 30 of our 60 minutes together, sometimes going for a walk? Now, it just catalysed a completely different conversation. What if once a month we had an open invitation to other departments to come and have a breakfast with us? That's a real question that an organisation inside the financial sector, an internal service organisation, asked when they were having some difficulties with the people that they were serving actually understanding the service that they provided. So they said, why don't we offer breakfast and get people to come in and have a chat with us? And you know, that was just one person asked that question one day, and it catalysed a whole system and increased immensely the breaking down of silos in that particular organisation. And finally, what if we created a world-class personal and professional development program? I've had the pleasure to work with an organisation that had nothing to do with personal and professional development, except for it was something that was important for that organisation to develop its skill base. So it was an internal service again. They got everyone in their organisation to come together to talk about this, not just the learning development people, which is the beauty of this question. They got everybody in their organisation, because at the end of the day, everyone's affected by the answer to that particular question. Again, please feel free to raise your hand or ask questions as we're going along. Let's just talk about how questions. Now, often we tend to go too early to how questions. So I encourage you to start with your what and your what if type questions first, or your clarity questions, and then move to your how questions, because how questions are very powerful after we've decided and clarified the direction we're heading. They certainly enable action, so they're really important, and they're very useful in change because they clarify what we're going to do, and they can also enable other people to get involved in the solution and making things happen. So how questions are critical, but too often people ask how questions too early in the process rather than waiting until we've got some of the bigger picture things clarified. So some examples there for you are, how can we challenge the status quo? How do we attain greater output with less resources? How will we break down silos? How can we create profit and maintain focus on our mission? Now let's just quickly talk about, after having spoken about how questions to generate questions. And we've just seen a little sample of them already. Questions to generate questions are unbelievably powerful. Have you ever considered asking what questions, if answered, would enable us to become the leaders we wish to be? What questions, if answered, would help us to resolve our interdepartmental clashes? What questions, if answered, would allow this organisation to be the best it could be? And what questions would, if answered, ensure that our team is better than the sum of its parts? I'm just interested if any of you have had any exposure to generating questions without actually coming up with the answers. So the answer to these questions is to come up with more questions. I'm just interested if anyone's got any thoughts or experience in that space. Not at this point in time, that's okay. What I've discovered when I've been facilitating programs where we ask what questions if answered, for example, the one, what questions if answered would enable us to become the leaders we wish to be, most people really struggle at first to come up with questions because they're so used to answering them. Or when they start coming up with the questions, they automatically start trying to answer them at the same time. Jock, you've got some input here for us? Hello, Jock?
Yes, I've had a little experience in this. I worked with an organization that ran a competition every 4 years. And this was an international competition, and they struggled on a number of fronts, and mainly because the artistic committee didn't spend enough time talking to the administrative committee, and which didn't spend enough time talking to the board. And my solution was to get them all in the same room at the same time, and all these people came in, and they were all full of their heads were full of all the things that had gone wrong, how we'd run out of money and how this hadn't happened, this didn't work, and that sort of stuff. And they were looking towards the upcoming competition, which they were about to become involved in. They were about 2 years into their 4-year cycle. And it wasn't actually me that came up with the question, but my assistant, Tiffany, who said, you know, I've been having a listen to these people talk about all the problems facing them in the next part of their journey. But I think the question that they really should focus on is, where would you like to be starting from after the current competition is finished? So in 2 years' time, after the current competition's all done and finished and wound up and everything, where would you like to be starting from? That was the question. It wasn't how are we going to get to where we need to get to in 2 years' time. It assumed that that had already taken place, and they had a fresh sheet in front of them, and they could imagine just how wonderful this could be and what resources they needed to have at their disposal and how they wanted to relate to one another. It was a really, really good question, and actually turned the corner for that organisation. It was very, very successful.
Thanks, Jock. Sorry?
Because they were thinking about the right things rather than the wrong things.
Absolutely, and that's the power of this sort of question that Tiffany, I think you said her name was,
Yes.
The beauty about this particular example too, thanks Jock, is that it highlights that when people are focusing on what's the question, that if I ask this question, I don't have to know what the answer is, but if I ask this question, that's going to really help catalyse this conversation and catalyse this team or group of people to really focus on what matters rather than maybe getting caught in some level of detail that's really not actually helping us go to where we want to go, like the question Tiffany suggested, which was, where would you like to be starting from after the current competition is finished? Completely shifted the conversation, didn't it?
It sure did.
Okay, thanks, Jock. We'll keep moving, folks. And that's just a quick reminder there. It's a challenge for you that as you're in conversations, think about what's the question that I need to ask right now. We'll just talk a little bit about question construction. And some of the issue about question construction is simple as starting point. A basic construction for question is it a closed question or an open question? And we've spoken about that already. So just reminding you that question construction is really about starting from the point of closed versus open, and or how can I combine closed and open questions together, focusing more, of course, as we've been trying to highlight, on open questions. Next is the scope of your question. Think about what's the scale that I can actually take this question to. So what does it mean for me? What does it mean for my team? What does it mean for my department? What does it mean for the company? Is an example of moving up the scale of the question. So think about what's the scope of your questions? Can you scale them up or down? And which scale might be more powerful for the particular conversation that you're involved in at the moment? And finally, what are the assumptions that we have embedded in the questions that we're asking? And Jock's question that Tiffany shared with him is very, very powerful because it was shifting the assumptions, moving from the how problems right now and the current competition to, well, after this current competition's on, where do we want to be then? I mean, it was shifting the assumptions that the group was using in the conversation. And Hewlett-Packard have got a story where they were trying to engage or increase the engagement of the staff in their organisation. And they originally came up with a question which was, how can Hewlett-Packard be the best lab in the world? Now, the assumptions that sit behind that are fundamentally about competition, because if we're going to be the best in the world, we're going to be better than everybody else. And, you know, in the conversations they had about, is that the question that will be the most powerful for our organisation, lots of people said, you know what, it's a good question, and yeah, it would be great if we could be number one, but I don't really know that it's going to fully engage the hearts and minds and souls and spirits of the people within Hewlett-Packard. And someone said, well, what if we were to change just one word and come up with a different question? And they said, okay, well, what's the question? And they said, well, what if we said, how can Hewlett-Packard be the best for the world? Only one word was changed in the question, the word in the world, the word in for in the world to the word for the world. Completely shifted the assumptions of the question, because how can Hewlett-Packard be the best for the world is a question that's much more about collaboration. So we could still be number one, but maybe we could collaborate. And highly powerful question. As we've been highlighting, the skill that you tend to build upon as a side effect of focusing on questions is listening. Listening has a huge increase as a result of not trying to listen better, but by trying to focus on what's the right questions to use, what's the right combination of questions, etc., will significantly enhance your listening skills. Everyone that I've been working with over time who we've helped to enhance their questioning abilities has come back and said, you know what, I can't believe how much better I'm listening now, because I'm not listening to try and find the opportunity for me to speak. I'm now listening deeply to what people are saying so that I can, in fact, contribute far better to the understanding of the group by asking better questions. So in summary, what we've been saying is ask genuine questions. So a genuine question is one where you don't actually know what the answer is and you're not looking for a particular loaded gun type response. Ask more open-ended questions. We're not saying don't ask closed questions. We're just saying ask more open-ended questions. Ask your questions for understanding, which is where you should be coming from the perspective of developing your questioning skills. Practice with the construction, scope and assumption structure to your questions. So try to become more conscious of how you're using them in the way that you're asking questions. The construction bit's a bit easy because you can just focus on asking more open-ended questions. The scope becomes a little bit more complex, and again, the assumptions component becomes even more complex again. So like any skill, it takes time and practice, so just have a go. The people you're working with won't necessarily have to know that that's what you're practicing, but you might like to seek some feedback from some colleagues and others and ask them, what did you think about the questions that I asked in that particular meeting? You know, how good were they? Did they seem to help the team to improve and go in the direction that it's trying to go in? And I encourage you, finally, this is the big takeaway, try to focus on asking the most powerful question to ask. Literally sit there and ask yourself, what's the best question I can ask right now? One of the only ways that you can discover how to do that is to really be listening to the people that you're working with. Now, if you're not aware, thanks for participating in this quick webinar. If you're not aware, I've just released my first book, What Really Matters for Young Professionals. I'm aware that some of you in the audience have already got copies of that, so I do appreciate you purchasing them. I also have a 16-lesson program that goes with both the book, and it provides a lot of additional information that's not in the book to increase your understanding of the 16 practices. If you join the OTM Learning Network, I know that a number of you are members, but not everyone in this particular webinar are members of the OTM Learning Network. Just remember that membership is for free, so that's otmlearningnetwork.com, and there are special member deals available within that network on the products that we have available. For example, the book and the online course are currently going for, with free postage, for $99 so Australian. So for $99 Australian, people are getting the 16-lesson course, the physical book, the free ebook, and the online course all at the same time. I've just got a question here to answer. Gladys is asking, will I be posting the PowerPoint? I'll be posting the video of this particular webinar. So the recording of the webinar, Gladys, is what I'll be posting to the OTM Learning Network. No probs. That's too easy, Gladys. Not a problem at all. So I'd like to thank you again for participating and giving up your precious time to join us today. please feel free to connect with me via the various forms that you can see on the screen. So again, through the otmlearningnetwork.com. If you haven't connected with us on LinkedIn or Facebook, please check out the Organisations That Matter Facebook page, and please feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn. That's great, Gladys. I appreciate that. Thank you. So thank you once again, everyone. I'm happy to stay online for a few moments longer if anyone would like to ask some private questions. But thanks again for participating.